Hello to everybody, and I just wanted to thank you, Australia and New Zealand Society of Evidence-Based Policing, for inviting me to speak today. I especially want to thank Lorraine Mazeral and Simon Williams, as well as the Evidence-Based Policing Center of the New Zealand Police for their efforts in organizing this wonderful event, and also for their flexibility in such an uncertain environment. And I'm glad we're able to meet again today on a different day. Today, I want to discuss policing as an intellectual profession. I will start with a disclaimer and probably say that this is the last group that I have to convince about this. So if anything, I'm hoping that my words will just provide some strong support of your efforts as I rally behind you on this endeavor. I guess in words, evidence-based policing seems so elegantly straightforward and logical. Why wouldn't we want police practices to be based on scientific evidence about what works best, as Lawrence Sherman so famously said in his Ideas in American Policing lecture in 1998. And in our book on evidence-based policing, Chris and I set out what sounds like an even more modest threshold for evidence-based policing, and that we're trying to give research a seat at the table. And to do so, we need to focus on translation, receptivity, and institutionalization of evidence into practice. But as many of you know, the implementation of evidence-based policing is really challenging. It's especially challenging because policing as a profession is so focused on procedures, for example, and not outcomes. And evidence-based policing's focus is on linking actions to outcomes. Policing often over-romanticizes anecdotal experience, individualized discretion, and hunches, which sometimes can contradict a scientific approach, not to mention can lead to bias and chaos. Policing has longstanding practices that officers are very much used to doing that are hard to stop, and that are also deeply reinforced and institutionalized by deployment and organizational mechanisms. Evidence-based policing is challenging because of the accountability and supervisory systems that are in place in policing that are often traditionally underdeveloped. And it makes it challenging to translate research ideas into operations or track interventions or monitor their effectiveness, as we've come to know evidence-based policing is about. And often policing lacks a dynamic learning environment and little incentive structures to adopt such a learning environment. We're currently in multiple crises here in the US, Australia, and New Zealand alike, which inhibits dynamic learning as well. So evidence-based policing may seem logical and straightforward, but I think in reality, it's a challenging endeavor that faces several deep-rooted and institutional impediments that make it what sociologists might call a wicked problem, or perhaps that engineers might label a complex systems challenge, right? And of course, we want to take this challenge head on because I believe it's the right thing to do, and evidence-based policing is so central to calls for reform. So to achieve evidence-based policing, it really requires us not to treat the profession as a linear job or a task or a procedures-based profession, or even as a craft, as some people may like to call it. The nature of the organization, combined with the goal of achieving the dual mandates of policing in advanced democracies, that is, achieving both public safety and also public legitimacy of the police and within an evidence-based framework, requires us to treat policing instead as an intellectual profession. And now, what do I mean by policing as an intellectual profession? I mean that policing requires an incredible amount of professional knowledge and competency, critical thinking about tasks and processes and their connection to particular outcomes, complex system thinking, as well as analysis and research to inform that thinking. This type of thinking also has to be evident and aligned across the ranks and units, and therefore solidified through a dynamic learning environment that supports the profession as an intellectual one. Research, of course, plays a central role, but I use the term intellectual profession to specifically point to not just the generation of research, but the application of it within this complex system that I speak of. This type of thinking is very different from a linear job or procedures-based approach or even a craft. No single quick fix, such as like new training or a piece of technology or even a hope placed in a new leader or a new policy is enough. Nor can we place hope in building some experience from the job that somehow will hone the craft as we get older in the job, right? We need knowledge, facts, research, translation, re-engineering of systems to accommodate that professional knowledge and competency, and really constant feedback loops from both scientific and democratic sources to maintain that dynamic learning approach. Now, of course, treating the profession as an intellectual one is certainly not the contemporary approach to policing, or for that matter, other criminal justice institutions. And let me say, it's certainly not how I perceived my job when I was a police officer in Baltimore City. When I finished academy and when I was assigned to patrol in the Eastern District of Baltimore City, my charge after field training looked something like this. Officer Lum, you're assigned to this beat. Your job is to answer calls for service, that come out on your beat and carry out preventative patrol, be omnipresent, and be proactive. The officers that are probably listening right now know that this is not actually how it sounds. Your sergeant throws you in a car and says, stay out of trouble, keep your head low, stay off the radio, don't call me unless something bad happens, right? And so that's how, that was my charge when I first got out onto the streets of Baltimore. And so what did I do? I went around, I drove around my patrol car, answered calls, backed up other officers. I focused a great deal on answering calls for service that came out on my beat, many which were very similar. When needed, I applied procedures to certain calls, but because many of the calls were vague or didn't really have any clear procedure connected with them, you watch other officers and mimic how they deal with situations, and you build your own experience and use your training to answer those calls. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Baltimore City. If you're familiar with the show The Wire, that's where Baltimore City is filmed. But in the late 1990s, the city averaged about 350 homicides a year. And my district, which was one of 9, had about a third of those homicides, mostly concentrated in the sector that I worked. So during that time, one common patrol approach was the use of something called zero tolerance arrests for everything, loitering, misdemeanor, minor drug offenses, people carrying weapons, et cetera, which was based on a particular interpretation of something called broken windows at the time to try to reduce violence. So for the first few years of my life as a patrol officer before I became a detective, that's basically what I did. Now, was I being the best officer that I could have been? I think maybe at the time I might have said yes. I felt like at least I was trying to be active and do the right thing. But of course, I know now the answer is no. At most, I was probably mediocre at best as an officer, and I certainly wasn't treating the profession as an intellectual one. I went with my gut. I relied heavily on my experience and others in a very insulated profession. I didn't think carefully about the policing mandate and whether my actions were linked at all to those mandates. And no one engaged officers in thinking more strategically or critically about our everyday patrol work. And the same was true when I became a detective. Now, the tragedy of all of this is that there's a whole science behind effective uniform patrol that I should have been thinking about and using, that I should have been trained and supervised on, held accountable to show professional competency, which is a core element in thinking more intellectually about my work. And this science of patrol includes things like where and when to patrol, accurately identifying environmental factors, routine activities of people, opportunities that contribute to crime, disorder, traffic accidents, you name it. Police have to have a grasp of criminological theory and empirics, as Lorraine has recently written about for the National Academies of Sciences. Relatedly, there is a crime analytic and problem-oriented science to analyzing the nature of community safety problems and to help tailor solutions to those problems. Evaluation research and problem-oriented policing sharpen our focus about what types of interventions to use and when. Colleagues like Tamara Harold or Jerry Ratcliffe and many others, Lorraine's group, have developed research in these areas. There is an entire science of deterrence or prevention, which we now know is not simply achieved with a blunt instrument like arrest. Different interventions and dosages of interventions lead to different effects of initial and residual deterrence or deterrence decay, which can then vary across people, places, and times. Folks like Dan Nagin, Chris Coper have developed knowledge about this. We also know that police officers can prevent calls from occurring by how they use their uncommitted time in between calls for service, not necessarily how they respond to any given call for service. We have a better grasp of some of the negative consequences of patrol activity, which can include disparity, negative community reactions, use of force in certain situations, backfire effects. This is critical knowledge because officers are trying to not only avoid risk, but we're also trying to figure out when things are going to go wrong and anticipate when things are going to go wrong. Of course, while on patrol, we're interacting with lots of people, victims, witnesses, suspects, community members, kids. And thanks to Lorraine and her team, we now have some knowledge about how those interactions can be improved and ways to even reduce the risk of harm, either to officers or to people during these interactions. So all of this to say, if I had thought more intellectually and critically about my profession when I was a patrol officer, I may have been a better officer than the one that I now realize I was. But because the profession doesn't treat itself as an intellectual one, patrol officers nor their supervisors are neither trained nor held accountable to think in these ways. And more importantly, perhaps, neither are the systems that impact an officer's behaviors work. Those systems don't necessarily prompt this type of thinking. I want to dig just a little bit more deeply into a specific example to applying an intellectual approach in an area that I research in, which is police proactivity. And again, this is just another example of what I mean by thinking intellectually about this profession from an evidence-based policing perspective. We now know, for example, a great deal of evidence that proactivity works much better than reactivity in terms of preventing and deterring crime. But even that statement is too general. Why that statement, with that statement alone, combined with the infrastructure, the existing infrastructure of policing, you're going to have the result of Officer Lum doing a whole bunch of stop, question, and frisk or traffic stops in Baltimore to try to reduce crime. Okay? And in fact, we now know that not only do officers focus primarily on reactive activities, but when they do proactive activities, those activities are really limited in scope. They tend to focus on traffic and pedestrian stops. They're incredibly general and unfocused from a geographic standpoint. And oftentimes there's a lot of fishing in proactive policing. An intellectual and evidence-based approach to proactive policing instead would ask, first, what are officers doing? How do we figure out what they're actually doing currently in terms of their proactive approach? And are those current approaches effective in terms of achieving prevention, deterrence, maybe officer safety, equal protection of laws, trust and confidence in the police, whatever the goals of the police department or the community are, right? Are those proactive activities actually achieving them? And how do we figure that out? How do we find that answer out reliably, right? Evidence-based policing, an intellectual approach, also asks or also states, if current practices don't achieve these goals, then how can we apply a critical approach to thinking about how to adjust systems so to motivate, prompt, or incentivize officers like Officer Lum, right, to use more effective or less harmful strategies that have been determined so through reliable methods of science. This requires even more critical, analytic, philosophical thinking about how to change officer behavior and simultaneously organizational infrastructure to accomplish this. What levers do we need to pull over here to get an effect over there? Training is only one small part of this, and certainly not enough to accomplish what I'm talking about here. In turn, with these adjustments, we then have to ask, did they in fact change behavior? So for example, if you offer a new training on problem solving for officers, did that actually lead them to start doing problem solving? Or was there some unintended consequence? And then why, if the unintended consequence happens, right? If you purchase body-worn cameras, did they actually strengthen accountability infrastructure or reduce negative outcomes like disparity or police use of force? And this is what I mean when I say that evidence-based policing really demands an intellectual approach. It's not enough to just say, hey, Officer Lum, go be proactive, right? Be omnipresent, go prevent crime on your post. Use your discretion, right? But that is what is happening. And then we see the result, which is unfocused proactivity that's general, that's often focused on what officers tend to know best, which is arrests and traffic stops and pedestrian stops. And these things often are at high risk of bias and bad outcomes. Let me just give a few more examples, but not from an operational approach, but from an internal approach to policing. An intellectual evidence-based approach doesn't necessarily need to be applied to operations or patrol, but also to many, many different aspects of internal functioning. Let me provide a few examples. For instance, an intellectual approach to internal functioning of police might ask, are there learning and supervisory approaches that can better connect training with officer or detective behavior? Notice that I'm homing in on developing the mechanism that links the training to the behavior, not simply whether the training was acquired or if the officer completed that training, right? Another question that we might ask in this kind of intellectual treatment of policing is what types of internal accountability systems work best to minimize the risk of problematic behavior and maximize optimal behavior? How do we build those systems? Again, notice I'm talking about building accountability infrastructure, not simply purchasing a technology that we think is somehow going to affect an accountability structure that we haven't yet even identified, right? Or in the first place. Here's another example. Are there supervisory styles and tasks that can improve officer satisfaction and performance in the field? Again, notice I'm not focusing on programs themselves or even programs for things like wellness programs, but I'm focusing specifically on supervisory interactions that might strengthen that relationship between first-line supervisors and patrol officers or detectives, right? And that strengthen officer work in that process. For example, using mentoring or coaching or more transformational approaches to supervision. And then how do we track that and figure out, did our efforts work or not, right? Some other examples, there's so many. You can think of them yourselves, I'm sure. What organizational policies and practices work to minimize negative employment outcomes, such as bad health, harassment, poor retention, hiring, suicides, etc. It's not just about documenting these things or identifying them, which is important. That's a very important first step. But what works to actually mitigate some of these issues, right? And leads to the outcomes we're looking for. How do we readjust or build organizational infrastructure to make technologies work in more evidence-based ways? Many of you, well, if any of you have seen some of my work in technology, sometimes people kind of think I'm a pessimist about technology, but it's not true. I think I'm more of a realist about technology. Technology alone is never a panacea in policing. Why? Because it's up against something much bigger than itself, which is the culture, the infrastructure, the nature of policing, all which trump the technology and its theoretical purposes, right? And so in order for a technology or anything, crime analysts, new officers, whatever that X is, and then if for anything to work the way we want it to work and for that output to be what we want it to be, the machine itself has to then contribute to the shaping of the use of that technology towards that output. And so an intellectual approach, an evidence-based approach, a critical thinking approach, a strategic approach would require us to work on the mechanism not necessarily focus so much on the technology itself, if that makes sense. Now, all of these questions and more require just a very careful thinking through, very critical thinking about how to achieve evidence-based policing. And I often talk about these 5 things, right? We need to generate the evidence. We then need to translate that knowledge. That knowledge, then we need to foster receptivity for translated knowledge inside of the police agency. We have to institutionalize that evidence into systems, and then we have to operationalize and implement that knowledge into practice. Again, these are easy things for me to say, but imagine every single one of these things has a life of their own with regards to thinking about how we might accomplish this. And I'm only going to just end today with just an example of one of these things, which is number 2, translation. Let's think about translation just for a minute. In order to translate knowledge into practice, right, we need more than just things like the translation tools that many researchers, including myself and people at Lorraine's shop, have developed, like the Global Policing Database or the Matrix or Crime Solutions, right, or systematic reviews. These things are very important, and they bring together lots of research, and they help translate that research in some way. But that's like the tip of the iceberg when we're talking about translation. Much of translation actually takes place inside of the agency itself. Police agencies need infrastructure to facilitate translation. This isn't just about chiefs or commissioners that can convey the knowledge from a very high level, but really having operational first-line supervisors do this, who are key to making scientific facts and information meaningful for the everyday work of their officers, right? For the first-line supervisors who are listening in the room, you probably are already thinking about the type of thinking, strategizing, mentorship, coaching, cajoling maybe, that is needed to make this happen, as well as how you might develop operations that are aligned with the evidence that may not be so obvious as evidence or research to a frontline officer. We also have to consider how to reconstruct academy, field training, and in-service training that actually teaches the professional knowledge, skills, and procedures that reflect the science of policing, that reflect what we now know about policing, right, and crime. This will require moving from a skills and procedures approach to one that emphasizes things like educational scaffolding, critical thinking skills, and also that figures out ways in which training is effectively translated or turned into behaviors, and then tracking those outcomes, right? I cannot overemphasize the need to dramatically increase the number and support for crime analysts, police scientists, and others that are doing research and planning in the police agency, and to empower these folks, because they are the ones that often help to digest, translate, and make sense of new information and data that's constantly coming into or being generated by the police agency. Most agencies fail to invest in this particular area of policing. They tend to focus a lot of their human resource investment in uniformed police officers as opposed to analysts in the agencies. But these folks are an important backbone of an evidence-based, of an intellectual approach to policing. And finally, outside voices are incredibly important to busting the insulated nature of policing and helping with the translation that I'm talking about. And I'm not just talking about subject matter experts or research partners, which of course are very important, but I'm also talking about community partners that help the police translate not only their knowledge into operations, but doing so in a way that fits the local context, right? Some agencies don't have the mechanism to systematically gauge the reaction and input of specific and relevant communities for specific problems. And often with police community relationships, the information flow is either one way or very much police-centric. Let me just say that I just spoke about number 2 about this slide, and I kind of condensed it in a very short slide. But you can imagine that each one of these things requires thinking about adjusting various systems of policing, institutionalizing professional knowledge and competency of these particular areas and knowledge about crime or policing. It requires building a receptivity to some new knowledge. That alone, it needs kind of creative thinking on how police might do that. How can we think about re-engineering different portions and parts of the machine so that they can be better aligned with some of the mandates of policing, these big, broad, advanced democracy mandates of policing that then have to be translated into everyday actions and activities of the police. Lots of thinking and figuring out needs to happen for 1 to 5 to actually occur. Let me just say that I think this challenge is exciting, and I hope all of you do as well. All of us are at, in my view, the cusp of and directly part of a period in our history in which we are transforming policing. And I think maybe even transforming it into this intellectual profession as I speak. I believe we are currently in a time in which we have an opportunity to re-engineer policing from the inside out, to rebuild the machine, so to speak, right? And I think the implications are profound and directly address what the police mandate is in advanced democracies. And I hope you aren't discouraged, let me say, by the magnitude of this task, because as you can see, just the participation in this conference and in this society indicates that many other people share this vision, and I share this vision with you, and are working on it in various capacities. So I say continue your efforts, don't be discouraged. And I very much thank you for indulging me and giving me the opportunity to speak with all of you today. Thank you so much.
Dr. Lum, thank you very much for your presentation. And we've got a bit of time to make, I think, some key, or reinforce some key points that you've made, but also to ask some questions. So I hope you've got some time to be able to take some questions from participants. I might come to questions first, if that's okay. So the first question that's come in, Cynthia, what is the one thing that policing agencies should do to change the mindset around prevention over reaction? How would you enable a prevention-first approach to the delivery of policing?
Oh my goodness. I hate to disappoint you by saying that I don't believe there is a single approach. To really bring home a prevention approach, to really change the mindset of police, is going to require what I call complex systems approach to address the integrated systems of policing. So for example, you could have a leader that speaks to this topic and that brings home a message that policing is important, right? But that will make no difference if at the academy level, officers are taught 90% of the time to be reactive, and that is what they should value. When they're on the street and they are put into a patrol deployment approach that primarily focuses on answering calls for service or reacting to maybe short-term problems or to a particular issue that just came up recently about something or other, right? When they're put on the street to do that, but they're not encouraged to use their time in between those calls for service for things like problem solving or community engagement or something like that, then you're also going to have a challenge in implementing a prevention mindset, right? If the agency doesn't have the tracking and analytic capabilities to promote a prevention mindset, specifically what I mean by this is crime analysis, people who can look at trends, folks that can anticipate problems, that can link seemingly different things together in a way that helps elucidate the underlying problems that keep creating some of these repetitive issues. If you don't have that infrastructure, and then let me back up a little bit, back out of that a little bit, if you don't have good ability to record and report information or map it out or hold officers accountable to reporting and recording accurately, then your predictions are going to be off, right? Then the analysis is only as good as the data that you're looking at, right? So while I appreciate the question very much, I think what the message that I'm trying to get across today is that it's not one thing, it's everything. And that those everythings have to be strategically aligned. If I had to focus on particular areas, I would identify maybe the 5 or 6 key systems in an agency: training, supervision, deployment and investigative deployment systems, managerial first-line supervisory systems. And then I would say, how aligned are those 5 to achieving this singular goal of prevention that we're interested in, or whatever your goal is, right? And then trying to work backward out of those 5, right? How aligned are they? How well positioned are they in achieving that particular goal? And then how can we address every portion of that, of those systems towards that singular goal? I'm sorry, that's probably not a satisfying answer.
No, it was a wider end question which required a lot of the answer, but I do appreciate the fact that you've given the answer you have, because you also mentioned training, and we've got a question here related and aligned to that around what sort of ongoing development, professional development, is required to adopt an intellectual approach, and what should the approach be from police managers and supervisors to help implement and adopt that approach in professional development?
Yeah, I often think about policing academy, field training, and in-service as being so disconnected from each other. Like in an educational environment, we have to talk about scaffolding. For example, officers are taught one thing, and then that knowledge is built on something through in-service, and then that same goal or knowledge, let's say prevention or community engagement or what have you, is then built on at the supervisory level with maybe some more advanced knowledge. I think one of the key challenges in policing that works against an evidence-based approach is the disconnect between the different levels of training at both ranks and also environment. So at the academy, you're getting some basic information, some very procedures-based information. And then you might go back for in-service and get something like implicit bias training. You go back or you get training on, you have to put in your 40 hours of training on your service weapon, right? It's like completely disconnected from anything, right? There's no underlying drumbeat that kind of links the purpose of the training, nor links the skill levels of the training. So there's no scaffolding, and then there's no thematic link of the training into some kind of broader mandate. And I feel like that, not to mention, let me say the basic problem of training is that the evidence is not being taught in training. So let me start there by saying that the vast amount of knowledge that has been developed about policing, about crime and disorder, about communities, about engagement, about disparity that happens in society and within policing is not being taught in the academy on a regular basis. And so first the knowledge, then the scaffolding, and also the linkage across the different types of training. And we really need, let me just also put in a pitch if there's any leaders or somebody who can fund the police agency, but we really need first-line supervisory training. The first-line supervisors are one of the, we call them sergeants here, or they're the first line of maybe supervising a patrol squad or something like that. They are the most powerful individuals, I think, in an agency with regards to change or blockage to change. And yet they're almost disregarded as a group in many ways in terms of leadership training or advanced skills training, et cetera. But these are the folks that we expect to mentor, to coach, to advance new officers that are coming up the ranks, to keep them out of trouble, right? And so I think first-line supervisor training is so key.
Thank you for those points. Knowledge, scaffolding, linkage and first line supervisor training. Really appreciate those key points. We've got questions flowing in, and thank you to all of you who are posting questions via the Q&A facility. We really appreciate those questions coming in. Please keep them coming in. We have one now from Jonathan, I think it is, who has posted a question for you, Cynthia, from the UK. In the UK, primary legislation brought police community consultation onto the statute book under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984 and the Crime and Disorder Act a decade later. The question is, what role, if any, do you see primary legislation to mandate evidence-based practice to help transform from its current niche to the mainstream?
Oh, that's such an important and big question. I guess I have a couple of thoughts regarding that. And you know, I come from a federal system that has a whole bunch of police agencies that are very at the decentralized local level that don't have to listen to that federal system, but that are incentivized in certain ways by, for example, funding or even what we have, what's known as consent decrees in the United States, which can impose an oversight from our federal government to local agencies usually for wrongdoing. I think there is some place for federal legislation, especially for certain things that maybe are the most egregious. A good example in the US after George Floyd was thinking about how federal legislation could be passed on to banning chokeholds, for example, or thinking about instituting consent decrees again. However, having said that, I think there's so many, and I say this as a former police officer, I think there's so many layers of organizational protection against very high level, and I include maybe chiefs and commissioners in their hopes and dreams about policing, right? Very high level ideas for policing. I don't think necessarily that because of these layers of protection, and also I'll add mythology and tradition, and also the high levels of discretion and low levels of supervision that go on in policing. I think all of these layers insulate the actual outcome of policing, which is very local, which is on the street, which is at 123 Main Street. That's where policing happens, right? And how that legislation trickles down to that, you know, I think is, there's always a hope for that. But if we want real change in policing, if we want the type of policing that we're talking about, evidence-based policing, then it has to happen at the organizational level, in my view. If the federal or if legislation can push or can incentivize agencies to do so, that's great. But you know, in the US, we used to have funding for example, community-oriented policing. And if you ask an agency, do you do community-oriented policing? The answer will always be yes. We do community-oriented policing. Why? Because if you don't do community-oriented policing, then you're likely not going to get funding to do something in your agency. And so the reality of whether or not police are doing community-oriented policing and what they're saying they're doing are maybe two separate things. I'm interested in that reality. How does that happen? And I'm not sure if legislation can fix that nitty-gritty aspect of everyday policing. It's not paying attention to the smallest things that are the most important things, in my view. It's hard.
I appreciate the hardness of it, but I also appreciate the fulsome answers that you've given to these questions, because as you've been answering the questions, we've had more questions coming in. So I do appreciate the fulsome approach that you've taken to answering these questions. I think we've got time for one more, Cynthia, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Sure.
The question is another one that's been put on our forum, and again, thank you so much to all of you who have been putting questions on our forum here through the Q&A function. We encourage you to keep doing that. With the professionalisation of policing and the call for policing to be an intellectual profession, do you think that police recruits should have a college degree?
These are great questions. You know, I entered the police department with a college degree, with an advanced college degree. And I don't necessarily think, and I say this carefully because I'm a big supporter of college education. I think it's incredibly important, especially if college education advances one's critical thinking skills and one's writing skills. I think it's important, and we definitely want to encourage people to try to get a college education. However, let me say that culture of policing, the nature of the police organization eats up anything that comes into the police organization. Okay, so we might have good intentions about bringing in people who are educated, or bringing in a diverse workforce, bringing in more women or people of color into the police force. But oftentimes those women, those people of color, the people with education get caught up in the approach to policing that's so institutionalized down to the cellular nature of every minute of every day of everything that you're doing in policing. And because of that, and because there's no encouragement to think otherwise, or there's no infrastructure to push you to think otherwise, it's easy to succumb to that. And this is why when I talk about technology, when you bring in a new technology in a police agency, a similar thing happens, right? The organizational frame, the technological frames of to use a sociological term, really eat that technology up alive, right? So whatever the intentions are of an input, the output always comes out very much distorted because it's going through just a prism of broken glass, right? That's been there for years and years. So to answer the question, while I always encourage an educated workforce, a diverse workforce, I don't think that's enough to achieve what I'm talking about. And I don't think you need to have a college degree to achieve what I'm talking about, right? This is just human thinking, and the combination of people who have different types of thinking that can work together on problems. You know, my dad was an engineer, and he always used to tell me by the time he got to, and he worked on the Apollo and the space shuttle. And by the time he got to working on these things, he often talked to me about, you know, it wasn't his schooling that helped him with that, right? He had to really think through problems and complex systems with teams of people with different specialties, right? In order to come up with the actual Apollo, right? The actual space shuttle. And yes, the basic information is there, the critical thinking that comes from a formal education. But the thinking that I'm talking about is a thinking that is a professional competency that applies the knowledge that is built from a wide array of thinking of people that aren't even in policing, of community members who have really good ideas about doing something and who place things into context that we should also be considering. So I know that's a very long answer to your question, but I think it could be a mistake if we rely too much on that type of solution. That's only one part of a much greater integrated solution that transforms training, in service, and what have you.
We're getting a lot of comments from people who've really appreciated the way in which you've answered these questions, Cynthia. So thank you very much. If you don't mind,
I wish I could see you. I wish I could see you all and talk to you in person.
No,
it's really hard.
You're not missing much on this end from me, trust me. There are some things I did want to touch on, Cynthia, very quickly, if that's okay with you, that you mentioned in your presentation. Number one, the evidence of what works, what doesn't, and what looks promising is out there. We can access it now to inform our own policing context. And number two, translating the evidence from paper to pavement is a key part in shifting our mindset and activity from response to prevention. And number three, and you've talked about this, education, training, and continued investment in developing the capability of our people in using and developing and implementing evidence is key. Going forward. Cynthia, thank you so much. We've had a number of people say thank you.
Can I add just one more thing?
I would love to, but I've got to go for time. I've got people waiting, Cynthia. Okay, very quickly if you can, that'd be great.
To the researchers in the room, it's not just about the evidence about how to deal with crime. It's about the evidence about all the other things that I'm talking about too.
Okay.
How to improve supervision, et cetera.
Thank you.
We need more evidence there.
Thank you so much. And that is a good point made. Thank you very much.